Okay, I think it's recording.
Can y'all hear me like clear from this distance?
Mm-hmm.
I've never done like a virtual webinar like this. Like I've hosted like conversations, but this is like very like where you can't see people's like reactions and faces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I've hosted like conversations, but this is like very
Different, yeah. The one with Miriam Kaba yesterday.
The Project Nia one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really good. And she was like, yeah, like, don't really want to be on camera. And I was like, you know what? Same. Yeah, I feel that.
Like very famously never shows her face. Like I've seen pictures of her because of like people have posted them when she speaks in public, but like if she has a choice, she never puts it like every article that's written about her is like the back of her head. Like and I'm like, it's so funny because like people like obviously like are literally like disciples of her and like have never seen a picture of her.
I know, and she's private on Twitter now, and I didn't follow her before she went from public to private, so I'm just
she goes back and forth really often. She also has like hella trolls, obviously, so.
Yeah.
Veda, are you going to stay on my Zoom call? I'm just wondering. Not kicking you out at all.
No, yeah, I'll leave as soon as it starts. I just wanted to see if y'all needed anything before.
Sounds good. And also, like, if there's anything going on in the Facebook chat that, like, you feel like should or would, like, interrupt what we're saying and, like, we should address in the moment, like, please let me know, because I'm...
Yeah. I'll keep monitoring it. I actually have it pulled up, and then...
Is it streaming already?
No.
Oh, okay. I was like, oh.
Also, like, if I send you a chat, like, the chat feature won't be seen on the Facebook, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay, so if I pull up the chat,
yeah,
it won't. Okay, great.
Just reading. I finished Avatar, like...
Oh my god! Was it your first time all the way through?
No, I watched it when I was younger, but, like, it was so good. It's so good.
So good. Did you know there were comics? Like, there's comics that continue the story. Yeah. I was Googling the plot. I was like, what happened to Zuko's mom?
I think I had a couple when I was a kid, but I never finished them through, and I really want to read them now.
Suzette, you said you haven't seen Legend of Korra, right?
I watched, like, the first, like, season, but I didn't finish it. But yeah.
You have to keep watching. It gets better.
No, I will. I just, like, I have to find it illegally because I'm not going to pay for that show.
I might pay for it, so hit me up if you want my password to wherever I...
If you have a Prime, Video account, Suzette, if you have a Prime Video account or you know someone with one, you can get a free week of Nick and watch it on that.
I saw that, but I was like, I want to give Amazon more of my money.
Fair.
But yeah, I might do it though.
Suzette, did you post the link in the Facebook or?
It'll show up on the event page, like once we go live.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm gonna go live, so Veda, if you want to turn off your camera, if you want to be seen.
Did you post the link in the Facebook or?
It'll show up on the event page, like once we go live.
Okay.
think I see it. Okay, I see it.
Y'all mind if I play some music while we wait to begin?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do it. The silence before a Zoom call needs to be interrupted.
That part.
Okay, we're live. It's on the event page.
Okay. Good.
George. Where it's like, just because this is virtual does not mean that you're not going to hear me.
What?
Jordan always has music playing in the MEC, so it's funny watching this happen like virtually and not.
Ain't nothing different but be on the screen this time.
Hey. No. Don't. Stop. Stop.
Okay. People are liking it, so they can see it.
Okay. Good.
Sounds good.
I'm watching the live on my phone. This is a different experience. Okay.
Why are you watching it? I would be scared of what I look like. Also, Brett, I've never asked you what your background is. I think you should tell everyone.
Oh, it's literally just, it's where we go for Camp Texas, and my room is a mess, so I just decided to put that up in my background. So.
It looks like my elementary school.
Yep, it does give off that vibe. So, oh girl, I hear myself.
Oops.
Yep, it does give off that vibe.
Just so everyone knows that's watching via Facebook, we are waiting a few minutes before we begin, just to give people some time to arrive, get settled in so that we can have this conversation.
Also, for my friends who are asking me why I'm not answering their questions in the FB chat, I can't see it. So that is not my problem.
Oh, Veda put in the chat, Lynn asked what y'all do today.
I ate some breakfast tacos. I prepped for this. And that's it.
I've been spending time with my family.
Fun.
I have also been prepping for this, and I also had tacos today. Yeah.
I was just doing homework. Just mind my business this morning. No tacos for me.
I started the second season of Pose.
Oh, girl. We should have started with you.
So good so far. I'm in like episode 5, but I'm holding off because I can't. I really can't.
Yeah, lots of feelings. It's so good. So good.
And I think, like everyone else with taste, we're all at different parts of rewatching Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Yep, correct. That would be correct.
The way I have not started watching that this whole time.
How are you looking out?
I'm gonna get there soon.
Should we give it like one more minute and then?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Oh my God, being told that 62 people are watching. I'm gonna ignore that.
68.
9.
Oh, George said a live update. Damn.
Jordan is watching us.
I'm watching us on the Facebook Live.
This is like Inception. My brain can't. It can't.
Should we start? 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Good?
Sure.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for tuning into this teach-in. My name is Brett Delatina, and my pronouns are he, him, and they, them. I am one of Senate's appointees to the President's Student Advisory Committee, and I am so happy to introduce two of my good friends today, Sarah Phillips and Jordan Walters, as they tell us more about divestment from the police and why we are calling for abolition over reform in the student community statement, which was drafted and endorsed by Black, Indigenous, people of color folks and delivered straight to the interim president, Jay Hartzell, through Senate. Sarah Phillips is a 5th year studying Asian American Studies and Government. She is also on Mutual Aid Collective Steering. She was a former director of the Asian Desi Pacific Islander American Collective and forever ad hoc for the Multicultural Engagement Center. She's also an organizer with Coalition Against Sexual Misconduct and an ambassador for the Center for Asian American Studies. Outside of UT, she focuses on South Asian leftist organizing and supporting the policing abolition movement work happening right now. Our other panelist is Jordan Walters, who is a rising 4th year studying history and African diaspora studies. They are an outgoing director of operations and current ad hoc student advisor for Afrikan American Affairs. They're also on Mutual Aid Collective Steering. They are the vice chair of special events for Texas Blazers, and they are a lifelong learner. I feel so absolutely lucky to know both Sarah and Jordan, and I'm very, very excited to hear all that they have in store for us in this teach-in. Also want to recognize the rest of the folks on this call, including Suzette Munoz, who is the Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator for Senate, and who will be asking questions from the viewers during the Q&A, as well as Cheyenne Grubbs, who is a leader of the Native American and Indigenous Collective in the MEC. All right, well, without further ado, I will be handing things off to Cheyenne, who will be leading us in a land acknowledgement.
Haleto Yakoke to those giving me the space to read and talk today. My name is Cheyenne, as Brett mentioned, and I'll be reading a land acknowledgement provided by both former and current members of the Native American and Indigenous Collective. In honor and recognition of the land we are currently on, this land is traditionally inhabited by Cohuetecan, Comanche, Apache, Tonkawa, Mexica, and all other tribes and peoples not explicitly stated. We honor Yanawana, water of the spirit and spirit of the water that flows through Central Texas, and all ancestors and guardians of this place. And we acknowledge that Native peoples and their descendants are here with us today. We recognize all other tribes, bands, and communities not explicitly stated or not yet politically recognized. We honor all of those who are indigenous to the land that is now called Texas, and we acknowledge that this institution was built by Black and Indigenous peoples. The spirit of the land remembers and acknowledges them. Yakoke.
Thank you so much for that, Cheyenne. Before we go further into our conversation today, we're going to take a 2-minute moment of silence for the Black individuals whose lives have been taken recently due to policing. Most recently, Dominique Remy Fells, Rhea Milton, Mike Ramos, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery. Rest in peace, power, and love. Thank you everyone for that. Now we'll go into our community guidelines. Sarah, if you'd like to speak on those.
Sure. Thank you all for listening, for viewing, for setting this up with us. It's really, really important, this conversation that we're having, and very politically vital right now. So the community guidelines that we kind of talked about was, we are not experts in abolition. I am a student of abolition. It's a framework that I hold very near and dear to my heart. I think it's the answer to so many problems that we see, and is the answer to a lot of the issues in our lives and in our communities. There are people who study and work on this their entire lives, have written about it for decades, have organized around it for decades, and I've learned, and we've learned about these things through personal work and reading, and it's going to take a lot of learning for you too. I think that's really important to understand, is that this isn't, a lot of people have learned about abolition in the last couple of weeks, which I'm so excited about, but it is not something that you can, watch one teach-in and learn all of these things, read one op-ed and be done. It's a framework. It's something that you have to digest and learn about over time, just like so many other things. So I ask that you understand that, and also come with questions and come authentically to the conversation. In the Facebook event, there is a Google form where you can ask questions. It's completely anonymous. We made it anonymous on purpose so that you can ask anything that you have. The facilitator and me would say that there is no stupid questions. We know that there are stupid questions. There are questions that we are not going to answer. We're not going to engage with any kind of like all lives matter bullshit. Like, that's not what we're here to do, right? But there are no stupid questions when you want to understand a framework. So please feel free to ask anything. And we will do our best to answer and or provide resources that can help expand your knowledge on that subject. And also, because of the nature of Zoom and the time we've had to prepare, we're not doing a presentation. We wanted to be able to just talk authentically to you about the demands, about what this moment requires. So we're going to go through the framework, the background, talk about divestment, and then a resource doc that we have put together with this information will be shared in the Facebook group and on social media to expand further upon what we're talking about. I think that this is the best way to do it, so that you can see our faces and, really engage with the material, and then have some homework, which, as I said, is going to be necessary. Okay, so I will pass it back to Jordan. The next
Yes, just echoing everything that Sarah just stated. Thank you to everyone that put this together. I'm so excited to join Sarah for this conversation, because Sarah is a fantastic individual, and we learn from her every single day. While we will be having a conversation, I will also be actively learning and taking notes, because That's what we do, and it's a lifelong commitment. So yes, I'm going to start off with kind of contextualizing today's conversation, but before I do that, I'm going to ask that we all take a deep breath together to prepare for what is to come. So what that means is that we're going to draw our elbows out, puff our chest up, and then we're going to breathe in for 5 counts, hold it for 5 counts, and then release for 5 counts. So let's do this together. In, hold, and release. All right, so let's get started. So yes, on contextualizing today's conversation. So obviously everyone is aware of what is going on right now with the various and unfortunate murders of Black folks all across this country and globally. I want to spotlight the Black Lives Matter movement because there are a lot of people who are using the hashtag Black Lives Matter without fully understanding what that means and what type of framework the founders of this movement are operating off of. So the Black Lives Matter movement was created by 3 Black women, Patrice Khan-Flores, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi. It is and was a call to action for Black people to rise up against systemic violence after George Zimmerman, who murdered 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, was not held accountable for the various crimes that he committed. And so before I go into some details about the themes of Black Lives Matter and how we should proceed in this conversation, as well as our commitment to fighting for the liberation of Black people all over the world, I'm going to read some excerpts from a history of the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement by Alicia Garza, one of the founders of the movement. So in the section titled, Broadening the Conversation to Include Black Life, it reads, Black Lives Matter is a unique contribution that goes beyond extrajudicial killings of Black people by police and vigilantes. It goes beyond the narrow nationalism that can be prevalent within some Black communities, which merely call on Black people to love Black, live Black, and buy Black, keeping straight cis Black men in the front of the movement, while our sisters, queer, and trans and disabled folk take up roles in the background or not at all. Black Lives Matter affirms the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, Black undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. It centers those that have been marginalized within Black liberation movements. It is a tactic to rebuild the Black liberation movement. And Garza goes on to state that when we say Black Lives Matter, we are talking about the ways in which Black people are deprived of our basic human rights and dignity. It is an acknowledgement that Black poverty and genocide is state violence. It is an acknowledgement that 1 million Black people are locked in cages in this country, 1/2 of all people in prisons or jails, as an act of state violence. It is an acknowledgement that Black women continue to bear the burden of a relentless assault on our children and our families, and that assault is an act of state violence. Black, queer, and trans folks bearing a unique burden in a heteropatriarchal society that disposes of us like garbage and simultaneously fetishizes us and profits off of us is state violence. The fact that 500,000 Black people in the United States are undocumented immigrants and relegated to the shadows is state violence. The fact that Black girls are used as negotiating chips during times of conflict and war is state violence. Black folks living with disabilities and different abilities bear the burden of state-sponsored Darwinian experiments that attempt to squeeze us into boxes of normality defined by white supremacy. And this is state violence. And the fact is that the lives of Black people, not all people, exist within these conditions is a consequence of state violence. And in the latter section, titled When Black People Get Free, Everybody Gets Free, Garza states that hashtag Black Lives Matter doesn't mean your life isn't important. It means that Black lives, which are seen as without value within white supremacy, are important to your liberation. Given the disproportionate impact state violence has on Black lives, we understand that when Black people in this country get free, the benefits will be wide-reaching and transformative for society as a whole. When we are able to end hypercriminalization and sexualization of Black people and end the poverty, control, and surveillance of Black people, every single person in this world has a better shot at getting and staying free. When Black people get free, everybody gets free. This is why we call on Black people and our allies to take up the call that Black Lives Matter, We're not saying Black lives are more important than other lives, or that other lives are not criminalized and oppressed in various ways. We remain in active solidarity with all oppressed people who are fighting for their liberation, and we know that our destinies are intertwined. Again, this was written by one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Alicia Garza. And some things that I really want to touch upon when thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement are some of the things within this text. So thinking about intersectionality. When we approach the issue of racism, it is necessary that we understand racism is deeply connected to all other forms of oppression. And I'm taking this from the work that has been produced by people like Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, Deborah King, the Combahee River Collective, and a host of all other people. So when you say Black Lives Matter, it means that you inherently must understand that we're not talking about Black cis men only. We are talking about all Black people, and your commitment to racism must be thorough and comprehensive. Also, Garza talks about addressing multiple examples of state violence, right? And so while right now our access point is policing, and the police specifically as a harmful force, we must understand that not only are our oppressions connected, but so are all of these institutions in the way that they project this oppression onto us. So when we start to attack or try and push for divestment and abolition, this is a conversation which we'll get into more later that revolves more than just the police. We're talking about universities, we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about a wide range of institutions. But yeah, that is kind of the things I really want to speak on in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I guess I'll also add that with us still being deeply entrenched in a pandemic, not only are we seeing that it's necessary that we proclaim that Black Lives Matter in regards to police violence, we also proclaim that Black Lives Matter in regards to the ways that COVID-19 is disproportionately and negatively affecting Black communities and other communities of color. So with that, I'll move on to touching on some definitions from critical resistance. Critical resistance was formed in 1997 when activists challenging the idea that imprisonment and policing are a solution for social, political, and economic problems came together to organize a conference that examined and challenged what we have come to call the prison industrial complex. And to give you a better idea of what we're going to be talking about in this chat, I'm going to define, using the definition of critical resistance, what the prison industrial complex, or the PIC, is, and also what abolition means. So according to critical resistance, the prison industrial complex is a term we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. And then they define abolition as a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. And they say that from where we are now, sometimes we can't really imagine what abolition is going to look like. Abolition isn't just about getting rid of buildings full of cages. It's also about undoing the society we live in, because the PIC both feeds on and maintains oppression and inequalities. Abolition is both a practical organizing tool and a long-term goal. It means developing practical strategies for taking small steps that move us towards making our dreams real, and that leads us all to believe that things really could be different. It means living this vision in our daily lives. So again, that's from critical resistance to kind of give you a solid foundation for what we are about to speak about. So with that being said, I will pass it over to Sarah so we can go ahead and entrench ourselves in abolition over reform.
All right, so the first thing that I have to talk about is capitalism, because I don't know how we don't talk about capitalism when we're talking about abolition. And again, this is something that will take a while, right? If this is the first time you're engaging with capitalism as a violent form of oppression, this is going to take a minute, but I'm going to give you all that I have. Okay, so Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore is an abolitionist who has been writing and developing the abolitionist framework for decades. She's kind of like this hero for the abolitionist movement. If you have ever read Are Prisons Necessary in the New York Times, she was spotlighted in the New York Times, and it talked about her journey as an abolitionist. I had the pleasure of being in her presence once last year and listening to her talk, and it was very much the most illuminating hour and a half, 2 hours of my life. So she talks about racial capitalism, and her way of talking about it is capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. So capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. Capitalism requires an exploited population. Carceral capitalism has created a system where people can be so totally devalued by the state that they can be expected to be policed and imprisoned through multiple institutions. And capitalism can never address the roots of these problems of poverty and violence and education and so many things that crop up in our lives that oppress us and create inequalities. And it is wholly disinterested in the idea of life being precious. You can only be productive. You can only be valued based on your work, your labor, and what the state can actually take out of you and extract from your community. So it's important to understand that, because abolition is also interested in abolishing capitalism. It's a wide-ranging, vast framework, and the PIC is one of these institutions that enshrines racial capitalism, and it also feeds upon the inequality that capitalism creates. So moving on, we're going to talk about what reform versus abolition actually means. These are words that have been thrown around a lot in the last couple of weeks, and we want to kind of develop this framework for y'all and understanding how to suss out what is reform, what is abolition, and why abolition is the better option. So one of the things that I want to push back on is the idea of reform being the gradual or incrementalist form of dealing with policing. So this is something that's talked about a lot, how we need reform because it needs to be gradual, how we need to just hold police accountable, because if we hold police accountable, then we can totally change the system. These things are actually false. Reform is actually structurally a setback rather than an incrementalist move forward. So reform often entrenches these systems of policing and carcerality rather than scaling them back, which is what abolition requires us to do and think about. It's important to understand that the current carceral and policing systems that are in place right now were the reform. Okay, so Angela Davis talks about this a lot, how the current PIC was the reform. It was their idea of making things better. Before you had prisons, you had people being executed for any amount of crime. Before you had policing, you had slave patrols. Like these things, you have to make the connection between these to understand that the current violence we have is because of reform and because of not grasping problems at the actual root of it. So the PIC is a product of reform. It's really important to understand that. It's also really important to understand that abolition is not just the closing of prisons. So we often get this question of like, well, we need reform because we need a way to deal with people who cause harm or criminals or any number of words used to describe people who commit harms against other people. And abolition is not just the closing of prisons or just the end of policing, even though those are goals that we are advancing towards. It is a theory of change. And Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about abolition as a presence. So it is the building of something, you're imagining something new, and it takes a tremendous amount of imagination in order to do that. And this is where something, there's a struggle here, right? Like, even if you've never interacted with a police officer, you've never had a family member in prison, you have engaged with the carceral system, and these ideas of people being disposable and or populations that need to be policed has been entrenched within you. I think we're having a larger conversation about carceral mentalities. We engage with propaganda all the time. We have, scores of TV shows that depict the FBI as the root of all justice, right? And we know these things to be not true, but it's hard to actually disengage from them. I've struggled with this as well. And these are things that you have to understand as being entrenched with you, and you have to actively scale them back. The things that we see on television and that are described to us as threats to our safety are often exaggerated in order to actually make us feel like we need the police to protect us, even though day to day they're not actually doing any of that work. Most police officers are doing things like traffic tickets that are just criminalizing people for existing, that are stop and frisking people for no reason, that are not actually engaging with crime, but actually being used as agents of public and social services. So if something happens to something on your street, why do we call the police? If there's a mental health issue, why do we call the police? Like, these are things that actually should be funded through social services, but are actually, the police are then called to deal with the situation. And we know how these things often end in violence and people being criminalized and or killed. So let's see. One of the other differences between abolitionist tools and disguising reform is to think about what it means to ask people to wait for change over and over and over again. So when you're asking people to wait for change over and over again, when you're telling Black folks in America to again wait for change from an institution, people are dying in the meantime, right? People are dying while you're waffling over this institution, and you need to be able to you have to grapple with that. You have to say, I'm telling you that you need to wait for change, which is actually really, really violent.
I'll say something real quick, Sarah, on that point, because very seriously, while we are waiting for these things to change, people are dying. I probably shouldn't say this on live, but in the protests that I have participated in, we were literally pushing back against state violence because of the multitude of Black individuals who have been killed. And while we were doing that, we were being killed. We were being assaulted, we were being attacked, we were being antagonized. And now there are several people in the Austin area who are in the hospital, who are Black individuals, who could very well die because of this consistent wait for things to go on. And so when Sarah says that, it's not something that's kind of far away from us. It's something that we all actively participate in every single day, whether it's at a protest, whether it's the fact that there are homeless individuals on the street or houseless individuals on the street who are actively dying before our eyes while we are trying to push for things like reform.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So yeah, and I think that also speaks to the, larger point we're having about reform, this conversation between reform and abolition as reform actually being violent itself. It's not that you're gradually working towards that goal with reform, you're actually actively being violent by saying, we're gonna hold the police accountable, even though we've proven over and over again that the police cannot be held accountable, that we need the police when whole communities of color have never been able to call the police and expect actual help to come to them. So we need to think through the actual violence of reform. And the concrete way that I can talk about this is Ferguson. So Ferguson, after the Ferguson uprising, there was a national, I would say international focus on Ferguson as a place that needed reform. There was all of these reports coming out about like all these racist things that were said by Ferguson police officers, the fact that the entire city seemed to be running on the revenue of pulling people over for no reason. And these were all points that were made to the DOJ, but also to larger reform, to people who wanted to reform and say like, okay, if we can fix these problems, then policing in Ferguson will be fine. And that's not what happened, right? Ferguson was under a microscope, and the killing people in Ferguson by police has not changed, and actually I believe in 2019 increased. So to think about Ferguson as this place that has a spotlight on it, that was supposedly held accountable by the U.S. government, by the Department of Justice, by these, large reforms, we can see is clearly not true. And you can also see this right now in the advance of the 8 Can't Wait campaign that's been making circles in like the police reform crowd. And I thought it was really irresponsible to release something like this when we've seen over and over again how these reforms don't work. But it actually kind of proved itself to be ineffectual in the last week, because when it was released, police departments that have killed numerous people since they actually implemented these reforms were posting checklists of the reforms and saying, oh, we did this, and we did this, and we did this. I believe the San Diego Police Department did that. And someone, rightly pushed back and was like, y'all were using rubber bullets. Y'all shot your they shot their implicit bias trainer during a protest with a rubber bullet. And it's like, I don't know how to more clearly show that these reforms actually are ways of protecting the police, because when something happens, they can say, well, we implemented all these reforms that we were told to implement by different campaigns and by the DOJ or whoever it may be at the time, based on, you know, how these institutions are politically politically situated. But it's not doing anything. It just shields the police from accountability and defunding by saying that they're working on the issues and that they're implementing these things. So body cameras, for example. Body cameras were a huge reform that I would say everyone I knew was talking about how body cameras were the answer. And Abolition showed me that actually implementing body cameras increased funding to the police, and also in numerous situations where the police brutality was actually recorded by body cameras, the people could not actually access those tapes because the police have protected themselves from those tapes ever actually getting out in order to hold them accountable. And also, police officers turn off body cameras. They know what is happening. They know that their police union, the institution, and the state will protect them from whatever is going on. So, you know, these narratives we hear about the state holding police accountable is not actually an effectual way of going about this. And I think history has clearly shown this. And I think that's definitely reading that you should do if you're looking for something, is like really ingesting Abolition means, you know, really breaking down how reform is not working. And the only thing we can do is actually shrinking the violence and the purview of the PIC, of the prison industrial complex.
Sarah,
yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to jump in with this question that Suzette just put from the Facebook chat. Is abolition compatible with the concept of the state, or does that need to be dismantled as well?
Yes.
Burn it all down.
Yeah.
So
I forgot who said this, but abolition of the PIC also involves abolition of borders, also involves abolition of the state. And this is really hard for people to ingest. And I think this is why we need to be having these conversations of what abolition actually means, because turning abolition is something that you want it to be is not actually the answer to this, right? Like, let this moment radicalize you. Like, let this moment where you're embracing abolition radicalize you about everything else as well. And that means the state as well. And I say the thing about borders as well, because there's a lot of great scholarship about how detention is viewed as different than the PIC when actually it is, you know, very much involved in the PIC, and the actual border is a violent arm of the PIC, and the actual like policing that goes along, not just the border as the physical border, but the like metaphorical border of like being able to be stopped by the police and then detained and then deported and like experiencing violence that way. So yeah, I just add that as well. Like we're thinking abolition is like this huge vast thing, and it is as vast and even bigger than the actual prison industrial complex. I mean, there's so much to be said. Abolition includes abolition of the military. Sorry, like I don't, yeah, like these are the things that you have to think through. So thank you for that question, because yes.
I think that's a really good kind of segue, I think, into what was going to be discussed next, is that, well, first that, yes, like Sarah said, that includes, we're burning the entire, everything. Everything has to go. We have to make a clearing for something more. And, this project, or abolition as a framework and a practice, obviously ties hand in hand with decolonization as a complete and total process that is a global process, right? So this, again, is kind of like our access point and our means of making that come true. But realistically, when we have these conversations, we have to think not only about the US context and the multitude of institutions here that perpetuate all sorts of oppression, but we have to think globally about how we are projecting those forms of oppression everywhere, and how everyone collectively needs to make a shift and break away from what we have come to understand as normal. And then in terms of, I guess, the next section, abolition of policing versus abolishing the police. What's happening is that language is, I don't want to say co-opted. I just think that people are specifically identifying abolition with only the police. And so when you do that, you fail to recognize that, again, this is a complete and total project. So we speak on abolition of policing because that's what's guiding all of these institutions to do what they are doing. But also on an individual level, I want to speak on how you have to kill the cop in your head, right? Because even for organizers, and including myself and other people who are committed to social justice work, we have a police in our head that is kind of keeping us in what's the word I'm looking for? Keeping us in line and helping us to keep others in line. And It's Going Down, which is a digital community Center for Anarchist, Anti-Fascist, Autonomous, Anti-Capitalist, Anti-Colonial Movements, says that power is so well ingrained that the police almost never need to intervene for the status quo to be respected. Control is internalized in our bodies and our minds. So not only is this a challenge for us to really consider the ways that our institutions are policing our behavior, but this is an internal struggle and an internal conflict for us to recognize the ways that we are policing each other. And good examples of this are seen with, I believe it was NYPD that was calling for, if you see something, say something. You know, that's us internalizing the need to act as a cop, but without a badge. That's us recognizing that we need to assist the police in what they're doing so that we can ensure that our communities are safe, which is not exactly, which is not true, and it's not something that we need to be doing. Another example of this is when you are at protest, and you have people who are assisting the police in identifying individuals who are disrupting the norm, right? There's a lot of talk about peaceful protests and people are destroying our city and this, that, and the other. And I believe, in my opinion, that that's what's necessary for this change to take place. If you want to be peaceful, and in many cases, we have people who are being peaceful. But if someone disrupts the street, they are disrupting the norm, they are disrupting the status quo, and you do not need to be the one to identify them to the police because you further the policing as a framework and you re-entrench us in this status quo. So when you think about killing the police officer in your head, you have to really lean into that discomfort. You have to think about, okay, if something is going on, what are my alternatives than calling the police? And who else am I going to put in danger if I do call the police? And that process is a bit hard because, again, for some of us, you know, this is kind of all we know, this is what we've been taught. But Sarah spoke on imagination. And it's so incredibly important that we imagine what a world without police looks like. One, because there are instances where there are communities that don't have police. But also, that's our strongest tool. And whether we realize it or not, we are imagining every single day. When you think about what you're going to eat for dinner, when you think about what you're going to wear the next day, for my religious folks, when you imagine heaven, when you imagine what this place of greater looks like, you are engaging in that practice. So why don't we use that to imagine what a police-free world looks like? What a world that isn't predicated off of exploitation and brutalization looks like. So yeah, kill the cop in your head. Anything else you'd like to add, Sarah?
That was incredible. I don't know what I would add. Sorry, go ahead, Sita.
Yeah, I actually have a question. So what are abolitionists currently advocating for? Are we aiming to abolish all prisons and police right now, or do it over time with total abolition as the end goal? I believe in abolition as an end goal, but I'm unsure we can build new systems that quickly if we want to abolish prisons, etc. immediately. That was a question from the audience.
That is the perfect question because that is what we're getting into. So the other things that I wanted to mention, because this is a university context, is to think about how policing is embedded into other institutions, like other places that you don't think of as policing, in this, abolish the cop in your head idea. So, I think there's a really important conversation going on Twitter and different spaces about how RAs at UT are trained to call the police for every incident under the sun. Like someone reports someone walking in the building, you call UTPD. That's that's policing. That's the person who said that, looked at that person and was like, hey, the cops need to be called, but also on the other end, being trained to say that the police are the answer to every situation. We know that when police are called for mental health issues, that it actually escalates the conflict and often ends in the person on the other side of that being criminalized or harmed by the police. So, you know, housing issues at UT being part of a policing lens, you know, just the way that in which we police who walks around, and usually it is Black people and Black students at this campus that are under that policing lens and that have the cops called on them. We know that to be true.
Yeah, and I'll add real quick, specific to some of the demands, right, that student leaders have put together. One of those demands is to do away with the Eyes of Texas. And what we are seeing is that so many of you are so damn tied to that song without recognizing the harm that that song perpetuates. And whether you realize it or not, it's directly correlated to the way police operate in this nation. I'm not going to go into the full history of the song, but just know that it's racist. It was sang by people who had blackface, and there's a host of other issues why it's a problem. Look it up, Google is free. But the song basically tells us that Black people are worth nothing and that they are here for us to exploit. They're here for us to disparage. They are here for us to beat down. And then that consistently makes us a target, frames us as a target of the police to do what they are doing. So whether you realize it or not, when we continue to, well, not we, because I don't sing it, but when people continue to sing the Eyes of Texas, they continue to recognize that Black people do not matter and that Black lives are not relevant to the humanity of all the rest of us.
Exactly. And I think that what Jordan just said is also an important point to everyone who's been telling me that they're for abolishing the police, but not the Eyes of Texas. One, that's confusing as hell, but two, it's actually not abolition because you need to be killing the carceral ideas that you're ingesting as well. Also, the other point I'll make before we move on to what does a society without police look like is the university being an institution that is expanding policing into communities of color and houses communities in Austin. We're literally an agent of violence for our surrounding communities as well as UT buys up land and expands into communities of color, but also already decimated the communities of color when it began to exist, but also, you know, every day when houses communities are literally moved away from UT, you see it when you're walking down Guad, like 100 cop cars like parked around 3 people just sitting on the sidewalk who are not harming anyone, who are just being criminalized for existing. And they're doing that because of this large structure that UT is that doesn't want to see that doesn't want to interrogate what they're doing to impact houseless communities. And you know, students call the cops on houseless communities in Austin all the time. And we've actually been used as the reason why UTPD should and does harass houseless communities, and we need to contend with that. And actually divesting from policing as a university would be the way to contend with that, to fix that situation. Okay, so let's move on to what does a society without police look like? So the answers to these things is one, the imagination that Jordan and I have been talking about. You know, you need to actively think about not just the closing of prisons, not just the end of policing, but also what we're creating, not even as an alternative. I still have an issue with the idea of alternative because you don't actually need the police and you don't need an alternative to it. You need something that actually addresses things at the root of the problem. Most violence is not solved by calling the police or with prisons. It actually perpetuates it, expands it, and harms more people. So there is this book that I literally tell everyone I know to read. It's called Beyond Survival, Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement. I literally think everyone should own this book because it answers so many of the questions that I get about, you know, it's often talked about. Abolitionists are often asked, what about the murderers? What about the rapists? And the thing that I encourage you to think about is to not shy away from that question and to not think that there is not an answer to that question because you don't like the answer, okay? So the answer to that question is that the current criminal punishment system which the criminal punishment system is often what people call it, is what I call the criminal justice system, because there's no justice involved. So the criminal punishment system does not address the root problems that happen when sexual violence happens, when harms are committed, or when people are killed, okay? It does not prevent those things. And it doesn't actually do anything for justice of the survivor at that moment, because it does nothing to say that people should get therapy or that people should have their, should be able to go to a hospital for free. It doesn't do anything to actually address the harm. It just puts people in cages. And because we're doing the work of imagining prevention and a new society, abolition requires that, we think about mental health as a lifelong issue that prevents things from actually happening before it does. Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about all the ways you can intervene before someone messes up. And I know that sounds soft to a lot of people, but we have to understand human beings are harmed every single day of their lives by racial capitalism, right? And so the answer to this is imaginative, but also I want to say that there are people who are already practicing transformative and restorative justice as a means to create community accountability processes and support survivors in the moment, because there are communities of color, particularly Black and Indigenous communities, that have never been able to rely or call the cops. So restorative justice talks about how it's an individualized process in which people can go through accountability processes to address harms. It's not a means of forgiveness. It's not a means of saying that the harm never happened or anything like that. It means that there's a process, that it's a long thing that cannot be solved by a prison or a cage. And transformative justice is struggling with words now. Transformative justice is is the broad vision for addressing things at the root of the problem, that says that it's not just the two people that were harmed in a situation, but it's also society as a whole, and you need to fix all of it and actually abolish the whole system in order to address the root problem. Let's see, and the reason I mentioned Beyond Survival is that it has stories from people who are actually going through these processes right now. I'm not a transformative justice practitioner, so I don't want to get really into transformative justice, but like I said, this is going to take some time in studying, and transformative justice Beyond Survival goes through accounts of what happens when you use a restorative or transformative justice model in cases of child sexual violence, like childhood sexual violence. We're not shying away from these things. Transformative justice advocates are not shying away from harm. They're actually providing answers and, giving us stories about what happens when you try things out and being imaginative about it. There's all these accounts of mistakes and how things can go wrong and how people are, are so harmed by a situation that an accountability process looks ugly and it's messy. And I was reading last night this book again, just to think through it. And one thing that stuck out to me is that accountability processes can take 2 years, right? When any situation in, a process held by the police, the courts, and the prisons, is a survivor of violence able to say, this was a 2-year process where my needs were looked after, where people asked me what I needed, and we were able to get to a root issue. Because the thing is that someone going to prison does not solve, poverty. It doesn't solve economic problems. It doesn't solve not having health care. It doesn't solve all of these other issues. It doesn't solve being criminalized. A lot of survivors are actually criminalized when they call the police. A story that I can think of is in this book. Someone talks about how she was being assaulted by her father. And when child services was called, because someone mandatory reported that something was happening, when child services was called, they threatened to arrest her mother, the only person who was actually protecting her in the situation, but was then criminalized by the fact that she was also living with the person who was abusing her. So this is stuff that happens over and over again. These are stories that are silenced and often not talked about, but the root issue here is that you need to understand that the current justice system, the current punishment system is not actually solving this problem, and that we have to be imaginative about ways to solve it. And also don't assume that people aren't already imagining those things and they don't already exist, because they do. There's transformative justice collectives in numerous cities. There are people who engage in restorative justice accountability processes in their work. We need a complete overhaul thinking about what justice actually looks like. I mean, an example that I bring up to a lot of people at UT is that there is there is a center at UT, IDVSA, which I'm forgetting what the acronym stands for now, but that has been working on restorative justice for years. They've come to a conclusion, they're implementing it. They've talked to the faculty council, and I know this because I worked on the Coalition Against Sexual Misconduct and realized that when we were doing research, that the research was actually at the university, even though they claimed that they had no idea what the hell we were talking about, right? And that's another way that the university and this institution silences things, right? Yes, so that's just Institute on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work. And they do restorative practices. They encourage people, I did a training with them. They encourage you to think of, implementing restorative practices in your life. And, it's not to say that the answer has completely been solved, but it is a process of imagining that we're trying to get you to think about. And you need to read. that is the only other answer I have for you, is to read about the solves and the imagining that people have already done. Okay, sorry, that was a lot.
I'll add to that. Thank you, Sarah. That was wonderful. I'll also add that not only is it violent the way that people are dealt with in terms of like survivors and whatnot in the criminal justice system or injustice system, but once people get into these areas or these institutions that operate off of policing, when you are in prisons, even when you are in mental health facilities, there's a variety of different examples, but oftentimes that harm is recreated over and over and over by practitioners of, well, I don't know if this would be the right term, but practitioners of policing, I would say. And so, the issues continue to, it kind of just becomes a cycle where nothing stops and nothing ends because we continue to ignore the root of the issue rather than recognizing that there has to be something different. And that difference is what we need to go for. Thank you, Sarah. That was, wow.
Thank you. And again, I'll emphasize that was a brief, speed through of a lot of different things, right? And so I encourage you to read. We'll send out resources. But the other thing that I want to mention is something that Mariame Kaba talks about. So we haven't talked about Mariame Kaba, but she is the reason that I'm an abolitionist. She's an abolitionist organizer. She's co-founded many abolitionist organizations, including Survived and Punished and Project NIA. She often has held teach-ins like this, talking about transformative justice, prison abolition, policing abolition, a lot of other things. And she talks about how there are already whole communities that exist without protection from the cops, and in fact, they need protection from the cops because the cops are what is inflicting violence upon their communities. She also talks about how another thing to think through why we don't need the police and prisons is because people who have harmed people the most are not actually sitting in prisons, right? They are our politicians. They run the banks and the oil companies. They're sitting in the White House right now, right? These are the people that are committing the most massive and large harms against people and communities. And because of that, because we've connected the idea of crime so clearly to moral harms against each other, that we think of people who, that's the idea that you would call the cops on someone who's smoking weed on their front porch. That's not doing anything to you. That's not a harm. That's not doing anything to you, your family, or your community, right? But that is what we call the cops on, and not actual harm, right? So separation of crime from actual harms is necessary. Decriminalization of a whole host of things is necessary, and that's part of an abolitionist framework, because you're actually limiting what the cops and the prisons can actually deal with. Let's see, and a great example of this being the war on drugs. Most things are actually resolved outside of systems of policing because, again, communities of color have histories of violence with institutions. Let's see, and I think we just got a question. Someone asked, what are some examples of communities without policing? Okay, again, I encourage you to read the book. There's literally 20 different examples. And it's not to say that the communities exist without policing, it's that they can't trust the police because the police are the occupying force, right? So one of the things that I can think most clearly of is that there's an example of Indigenous people in Canada when a woman goes missing, actually the community does the research on who actually did the harm, who might have killed somebody, actually investigating the murders themselves because the police were so inept at doing so and actively suppressing the idea that someone could have killed an Indigenous person. So I encourage you to read the book because there are examples, and it's not that the communities exist without the police, because the police are there. It's that they've chosen not to use the police as this means of like finding justice, because the justice has never been served by the police, if that makes sense.
And also, like, adding on to that a little bit, like I guess a good example of this that I've seen is that, like, there are already communities that exist with very minimal involvement of the police, many of them just being suburbs, like upper class suburbs in America. Cops aren't wandering the streets, people aren't being arrested, neighbors aren't being sent to prison, and like generally everything's fine. So there are already communities like in these examples that are functioning like very fine with the minimal involvement of the police. So just wanted to add that.
No, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so again, basically, I need y'all to read Beyond Survival. It's a running joke. Like every abolitionist, like, please read Beyond Survival, because this work of like, honestly, like us being able to answer this question is really complicated. Like I could do a whole course on, you know, like abolitionists could do like courses and years talking about communities and like how they individually deal with harm. And that's the other thing, is that the way quote unquote justice and punishment is served from the current criminal punishment system in the PIC means that there is no thought to the individual situation that that person is in. So transformative justice, one of the tenets that's talked about in Beyond Survival, means that you actually decide on the process once you've met the people, right? Because that looks different for every single situation. And because of the violence of the criminal punishment system, that is never something that is afforded to people who've experienced harms, right? And I say harms instead of crimes because, you know, for example, restorative justice could be implemented on something and should be implemented on something that are not necessarily crimes. So I think about this a lot in terms of the way that I view my life and like the ways that we may exist in a community organization. So someone is transphobic, that is not something you can report to the police, right? But that is a harm. That is something that is violent, that people you know, need to be held accountable for, right? But that is not ever going to be, I mean, that is not something that the police or the justice system is interested in, right? But a community accountability process would be able to address the harm, acknowledge what has happened, you know, have some restorative practice there to restore, and it's not to say that the person who is harmed forgives or anything like that. It's an actual conversation about what accountability looks like in that situation. And sorry to go on again, but the current justice system, the current criminal punishment system, Mariam Kaba talks about how because you are criminalized on the other end of it, it's actually really, really hard to hold people accountable and for people to admit that they've harmed someone. Right? Because why would you admit that you did something to harm someone when the other end of that, admitting that, is the cage or is getting arrested or put into prison, right? So acknowledging, and so what she has found in her practice, like in her actual practical practice of transformative justice, is that when it's acknowledged that no one wants to call the police, like no one wants to bring the police into this community or into this family. Most people experience harm within their own families and communities, right? It's not a random person walking down the street, right? So you don't want to call the police, and you shouldn't, right? That person is much more likely to acknowledge the harm that they've done and actually account for it when they're not being criminalized on the other side of it. Joy, did you have anything on that?
Nail on the head, period. I think I see a conversation though, or a question rather, about someone asking, can you touch on how simply funding social workers wouldn't serve as an alternative to policing and how social workers often enforce carceral logics?
Yeah.
I'll just briefly say, I think this is especially relevant to the whole cop in your head thing, but also the way that policing is used as a guiding framework to deal with any and all issues. But again, I'm not a social worker, nor do I necessarily have the expertise to speak specifically about that training. So Sarah, if you have anything to offer to add to that.
I'm not a social worker, but I can offer, something that Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about. She talks about, and these are not her words, I'm paraphrasing, remembering something I've listened to her talk about, is that because of how massive the prison industrial complex and how it has its hands in so many different areas of our lives, because of how massive it is, social services have taken on tenets of the prison industrial complex, and the prison industrial complex has taken on tenets of social services. So this is again the idea that like if a mental health issue is happening, that the police are called, but then vice versa, how people are criminalized for being harmed or being survivors of violence, or the example that I think most people point to and that I think is an apt example is that social workers historically in the United States have been responsible for actually removing children from Black and Indigenous communities and criminalizing the very existence of Black and Indigenous communities by doing so. Criminalizing cultural practice, criminalizing different ways of raising children, criminalizing LGBTQ people raising children and what that looks like. I'm trying to think, like, I mean, there's so many different ways that social work as an institution is a policing institution. And so that's why we don't say in the abolitionist movement that things can just be solved by calling social workers, because decriminalizing existence and actually killing the cop in your head and like abolishing policing would mean that social work as it exists today is not a thing, if that makes sense. So these are things that you can think about our community safety networks. There's an example in Beyond Survival about how I think it's the Audre Lorde Project, actually trained LGBTQ business owners to think through if something's happening in your space, what can you actually do yourself to de-escalate that harm? What are people is there a team of people in your neighborhood who have actually been trained on de-escalation? Like, can they be called to the situation? Like establishing, like, you know, we, for example, something that's talked about is like, we haven't established an alternative to 911, right? And that's something that needs to be worked on and imagined, right? And we're in the process of doing that, but social work as it exists today is not essentially the answer because it's done harm in the same way that policing has.
This, I think, would also be super relevant to, so obviously both Sarah and I work with the Mutual Aid Collective ATX. And when you think about these community processes, as well as like building community and caring for each other, that's why mutual aid is so relevant and so important to these conversations on abolition and policing, because there's no way that you can do these things. There's no way that you can collectively imagine if you don't have that built up trust and relationship with the people that are around you. And so when thinking about, you know, moving forward and collectively imagining and pushing for this police-free world, you also have to dedicate yourself to building those relationships with people and being able to communicate with those around you and breaking down the personal biases that you may have existing as well.
So the next question is there any alternative for violent crimes offenders at the same people with the same equipment or just with a different title? So my answer to this would be like, no, it's not just people, it's a different title. I think steps that that need to be made, for example, are this kind of like commingling and I don't know what the word for it is, but like that social workers and EMS and the police are all like one call and like one system that like there was an EMS person who was talking about how she, and every single occasion that a police officer arrived with her, usually escalated the situation, and she had to do extra work to then separate the police or try to get there before the police got there because she knew a harm would be perpetrated. Sorry. So like these are the things that we have to think about, is that it's not just titles, it's like the active divesting from the police of different social structures, and also this decriminalization of things is really important to this because, for example, if a social worker is called to a house, one of the ways that harm is perpetrated is actually criminalizing the situation. I don't know how to put this into words, but like criminalizing a mother for not having access to food, right? Like it's not that someone needed to be called to that situation, it's that mother needed food for her children, right? So like these situations that were kind of like the what ifs, right? If we're defunding the police, that money needs to go somewhere, right? That money needs to go to like the most marginalized communities in your city, in your state. And we need to be thinking about the things that actually prevent these harms. And also, I'm not shying away from the idea, like the question of violent crimes and offenders, but I am wanting y'all to think about why violence is perpetrated, what actually this is like, again, propaganda. We have been taught to say that you are walking down the street and someone is like, it's not to say that you shouldn't protect yourself, and it's not to say that, you know, there aren't harms that are perpetrated. It's not to say that things don't happen. It's just to say that most of the harms that you're actually, you know, like violence that is, you know, felt by people is usually people in their communities and in their families. Like, we deal too much with the exceptions to the rules rather than dealing with the root problems of them. And so, you know, violence itself can be solved, can be dissolved, and can be addressed through like societal changes, like guarantees of like food, housing, shelter, water, the internet. Like I just can't really describe to y'all the number of things that need to be addressed and changed. And abolition does address these things, but it does require imagination. And the what if questions, I totally understand why they're being asked, are the questions that I ask, but you have to understand that these things are constantly being like answered, and we don't actually have never seen a world in which we have addressed the roots of these issues, if that makes sense. We don't know what that looks like, right? We know what we need to do, and it's never actually been done, right? So I'm not shying away from the question. I'm just encouraging you to think about the amount of imagination that happens here, and how defunding the police, abolishing the police actually does address the root of these problems better than the actual justice system, and the punishment system that exists now. Sorry, that was a long answer, but is there any other questions, thoughts? We're moving on. We're supposed to move on to divestment, but I can keep talking about this for a long time if needed.
I think that was, again, thank you. Yes. I'm speechless.
Okay, I'm gonna add one more thing because I can't shut up. Okay, I've told many people who follow me this, but there is an episode of Justice in America. It is a podcast. I think it's episode 20 of season 2. I can't remember.
Yep, that is correct.
Okay, it is titled Prison Abolition and Mariame Kaba. And this is the thing that I send to people when they have these questions, because Mariame Kaba has been working on these issues for decades, and I am 22. So that is literally, you know, like there is only so much that I can answer. I want to help everyone have the political education that they need, but that is the starting point. Like that literal podcast episode answers so many of these questions in a way, in a framework that is so clear and easily understandable. And one of the things that she talks about in this is that violence, most people who have committed harms are not sitting in jail, right? We know this. Not only does the jail not address the problem, does not adjudicate justice, but the people who committed those harms are not in there anyways, right? We talk about this over and over again. Rapists are not brought to justice, even in the system that exists now. So Kaba talks about how community accountability processes are usually dealing with people who have received no form of justice. It is really hard to call the cops. It is really hard to report. Cops make it really hard to report. The entire world is against you when you do report. You're opening yourself up to criminalization, to being outed as a survivor, like to a whole host of things, right? There's a lot to be said on this subject, but I encourage you to listen to that podcast episode because she just shows how she was dealing with people who were getting nothing, that something had happened to them and there was nothing that happened after that besides them trying to survive, right? So yeah, I just encourage y'all to think about that, is that every harm that is committed is not something that the police even deal with. And even if they are called, they're not going to deal with it in the way that actually provides accountability and justice in any way. Okay.
Yeah, I also just want to very quickly co-sign that Justice in America podcast that Mariame Kaba put. As someone who is very fresh to just like abolitionist thought and thinking, and also as a survivor of sexual assault myself, I think the idea of abolition was something that I really had to work on and like think about, and also like in terms of imagination was something that I had like a lot of struggles with But as Sarah put, like this episode with Miriam Cobb, who's been a leader in transformative justice thinking, it's like very like foundational and very fundamental to opening my fourth eye, honestly, in terms of just like what this looks like, and how it can be implemented, and how like very much real and possible it is. So I really just wanted everyone to know who's watching that is very much something that you all should listen to as well.
Thank you for that. I feel like I'm spreading the gospel of that podcast episode. Like
you really did.
That particular one.
Everybody watching it, so yeah.
Okay, so are we good to move on to divestment? Okay.
So we can pivot over towards the demands and whatnot?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm assuming Brett, would you mind going over the demands briefly? I'm sorry if you don't have it pulled up. I just wonder if everyone
just like generally
just like the very, not the like a whole explanation, but just like
okay. So yeah, student community statement came with 8 demands that are calling for racial equity, and I'm stalling as I pull it up right now. The first of which being divestment from APD and UTPD, implementing test optional undergraduate and graduate admissions policy, incorporating land acknowledgements in all UT programming, using a multifaceted approach to incorporate conversations on race and systemic racism in the United States, renaming all of the racist buildings, some of which are RLM, Painter Hall, Littlefield, all of the Littlefields, there's so many, Hogg Auditorium, Hogg Statue, discontinuing the use of Eyes of Texas, the song, at all UT events, adopting equitable and inclusive practices in recruitment, selection, and promotion of UT faculty, and institutionalizing and funding a campus climate survey. And those were the 8 demands that were made.
Great. Sorry to put you on the spot. I just
No worries.
Okay, so moving forward, we're going to talk about why divestment is the effective way for the university to take responsibility of its complicity in the PIC, and how divestment works. We already covered why reform doesn't work, but specifically in the university context, there is precedence for universities divesting from, violent institutions, and this work is being done in Minnesota by, I'm forgetting the university name. I forget which university it is.
University of Minnesota.
Yes,
yeah.
Okay. And, I think that this political moment, and I think a lot of the organizers and writers of these demands would agree with me, demanded that we take that precedence and implement it at UT, and make these big, ambitious demands, right? Because I think that a lot of people watching this are probably like student government Senate folks, which is, I'm glad you're listening to this. But as an organizer, you need to push institutions. You need to hold institutions accountable. You need to say this is violence, and not simply be in the room and talk about it, right? And I know that that is hard to understand. I struggled with this too, as someone who came out of like these student leadership kind of ideas, right? But specifically at our university, organizing as a collective, uniting a student body and alumni and faculty and staff behind demands is an effective way of showing the university that the conversation that they're having is not the end all be all, that we can have our own organizing and our own ambitious ideas of what the future looks like. So as far as UTPD and APD, we've talked about the direct violence against Black students and staff, but also in the surrounding areas, because UT stretches into the Austin community and perpetuates violence there as well. So houseless populations of ATX are very much criminalized and demonized by students, by staff, by parents, by faculty, by administration, constantly viewed as only a, idea of violence against the student population, and not seen as a complete failure on the part of the state to address these violences at its root. Let's see. And these threats to unhoused folks in Austin are also, if we're talking about really big things, not big things, but things that we need to understand, is that a lot of unhoused folks in the city are actually unhoused because of higher income transplant students who have driven out communities in Austin, raised the prices of housing, gentrified whole areas of Austin. I mean, UT West Campus itself is built on a community of color that was razed to the ground. Right? I don't know how we don't see, I don't know how we argue that the university is not complicit in that. And policing itself and UTPD and APD and the ways it interacts with the university is an extension of that violence. The ways that, and the students are used as the justification for that violence. So therefore, university funding directly goes into harassing unhoused people and moving them off Guadalupe for aesthetic's sake, for a slim idea of safety that doesn't actually exist. Also, any of y'all feel free to cut me off. I'm just going on it. The difference between, I also wanted to cover the difference between policy promises and demands. Okay, so we had a lot of pushback saying like, this is not something that's achievable. This is not how you promise to, what if we promise this to students and it doesn't happen? Okay, so demands are an organizing apparatus, a framework of strategy, right? It's not to say that we're promising this to students. We're saying that the university has done violence, and it's not promising those things. It's saying that we see the violence and that we need to address it. And words with me. We need to address it and hold the university accountable for this violence. They're not policy promises. They're acknowledgement that the real powers that be at this university are the higher ups, they're the administration, they're the regents, and we need a unified student voice in order to achieve the things that can't just be passed through student government and Senate, right? This is not something that can be legislatively passed through the student government assembly, right? We can support, you get student government can pass a resolution that supports the demands, which actually would be great, but it's not something that we can just demand and then it be done, right? It's a demands. It's holding people accountable. It's holding the institution accountable for violence.
And I'll insert real quick
yeah.
that for those of you who are worried or insist that these demands are unachievable or that they will never happen, you are denying yourself your own capacity to imagine. And therefore, you're denying yourself your own humanity and the humanity of the people around you. You have to push forward and recognize that we do have power on this university campus, and that the administration that seems so far away from us and the decisions that they make are very close. And if we want them to be, we can make them even closer and get their attention. So don't question, whether these demands will actually happen, but think about the strategies that you are using to push us forward to making sure that they do happen. Yeah.
I have a question. So what are some tangible things that UT should fund for student safety that is not the police?
Great. So I kind of brainstormed a couple of things. And again, this is not something that should come out of just my brain. This is something that needs to be talked about and thought through and brainstormed and imagined. And I was kind of going to talk about it a little bit later, but I'm going to mention a couple of them, being that, let's see. One of the ideas that, the idea that we're at this university with this massive, research structure, all these people that are trained in so many different things, and we can't imagine a public health response to student safety is that's limiting, right? How many times are we told that CMHC can't be funded? I don't know. How many times are we told that we can't hire another Black counselor at CMHC? The things are endless, right? I work in the Multicultural Engagement Center. We are told all the time that we can't have a bigger space, that we don't have space for community, that people have to pay for their own books, that that access. There are so many things at this university that are inadequately funded that could help student belonging, safety, and mental health, right? And I think mental health should be a great part of that. I think if you get hurt at the university, if you get sick, you should be able to see someone immediately. It should not cost you anything. They shouldn't ask you for insurance. The idea that we're going back to the university next year and we have no guarantee that we can be tested for COVID for free. but the police are sitting on campus right now doing nothing. Like, I've driven by, they're just sitting in their cop cars, like, surveilling, you know? Like, there is a whole host of things that are not adequately funded at UT. Housing, are you kidding me? How much does it cost to live here and go to school? Like, I mean, again, there's a lot to be said about that things that UT should fund for student safety, but I again urge the imagination side of it. Traditionally, in abolitionist thinking, we are funding social services, so health, economic help to the most marginalized communities, mental health, food, water, shelter, those kinds of things. So thinking through that framework, I think, and applying it to a university structure would be really smart.
Yeah, and I think adding a little bit more onto that, I think a disconnect with this question is that a lot of people who are like very fresh to this are thinking of like, okay, so UTPD or policing sucks, like what's the next structure that would be the same, but like wouldn't be that? I think that is like how people are approaching it. But I think what we're trying to say and what abolitionists are trying to say is to come at it like what you've been mentioning, like come at it at the root of the issue, which is funding social services, which is funding public health, and all of these initiatives that go for prevention of violence and prevention of all of these instances of harm. And I think like that delineation like needs to be tabled in a lot of people's minds, and like that delineation needs to be made like very clear to people that we're not calling for an alternative like policing system, like as was made very clear, but a complete like reinvestment and refunding of like what is being funded into the UTPD into all of these different initiatives that would create student safety in a way of prevention and public health and community centered. So
amazing, perfect.
And yeah, I think that, you know, not only are we speaking about how these investments in other parts of the campus in more social services will better impact our life while we're at the university, but also thinking long term, right? You know, there are a lot of students, particularly students of color, who very literally are going in debt or are in debt and will be tied to that debt for the rest of their life. And that in itself is going to limit their access to social services in the future. So it's not that this is just going to be an issue that will positively impact our lives here and right now, but I personally want to be able to go. There's other questions that we should be asking about capitalism in general, but I want to be able to move forward knowing that I'm not going to be just entrenched in this debt because the University of Texas wanted to invest millions of dollars in UTPD and these things that do nothing for me, and therefore I have to have the burden of just being stuck. Yeah.
Great point. Let's see, I'm gonna see what we got. Okay, so one other thing about the demands is I'm kind of responding to some criticisms that we've gotten in the last few days. There are a lot of people that have criticized the demands as too big. And the response that I have to that is if you write a list of demands and believe that every single one of them will be done tomorrow, you are not thinking big enough, okay? And we're gonna go further, I know this is long, stick with me, but we're gonna go further into how an abolition as a framework teaches us that the demands are big and that there are things that you can do along the way to advance you towards that goal, right? And we'll go through that. But that's just what, like, my response to the idea of the demands being too big, right? These are not policy promises, these are demands. These are moral statements about what should be done to repair harms that have been committed by the university. And, you know, I also speak to my experience in the Coalition Against Sexual Misconduct. CASM made demands and every single one of them has not been fulfilled, right? But making those big demands and uniting a student voice behind them was an effective organizing strategy. And I stand by that. So, okay, abolitionist organizing tools. It was posted in the event, but there is a graphic that was released by Critical Resistance about what is reform and what is abolitionist tools when it comes to defunding, shrinking the violence of police, right? That is my favorite graphic in the entire world. If you have not read it, please read it. Please print it out and put it next to your bed and think about it, because it is the It is the most effective strategy outlined in a very simple graphic that I've ever seen in my life. And it has fundamentally changed how I'm able to view current movements against the police and to reform the police, because it very simply outlines how you can examine what organizing is happening right now and see whether or not if it's abolitionist and if you should support it, right? And we need to struggle through this idea of what is reform and what is abolition, because often in organizing, things get muddled and you don't know what you're supposed to be supporting. I'm gonna be honest, like people ask me all the time, like, should I be supporting this group? Should I be supporting this demand? Should I be, and having a framework for it is really important. Like, this is very tangible. Critical resistance has done that work, so please respect that it's been done. Let's see what's next. So using the graphic is a great way of approaching meetings and future organizing, okay? Our strategy here is to chip at the structure of policing at UT, right? I know there's people that aren't at UT in the call, but like, this is what we're doing, right? We're chipping at the structure of policing. Again, we said that reform is not gradual change, it's reinforcing the violence, whereas abolition calls for the abolition of policing. And the strategy there is to shrink the actual damage that's being done, the purview, and all the ways that it infiltrates into other areas outside of that actual police department, to minimize the daily harm and violence experienced by communities, and also, as is stated in the chart, to actually destabilize the idea for everyday people that they need the police to exist at all, right? So one of the ideas in that graphic that I think is really important when we're talking about this conversation of carceral thinking is to be very clear about the fact that these things that reinforce the necessity of police are damaging as well. Like, it's not just the funds, but it's like, what is this reform or action or bill that's being presented do to actually expand the influence of police in our daily lives as well? Let's see. So I came up with a list, and again, things are going to go interestingly, right? After these demands are released, as we continue to garner more support, as we call in more people, stuff like that. These are the things that I think in the university structure that we can do to organize with an abolitionist framework as we approach pushing these demands, okay? Things that I've thought of: refuse to sit on panels with APD, okay? This is gonna be a hard one for a lot of people because APD to the institution is absolutely essential. So therefore, if we were having conversations about refuse to sit on panels with the APD and UTPD. If we're having conversations about the police department, they're going to say that they should be in on that situation as well. We are addressing the harms done by the police department. The police department are not going to be holding the police department accountable, right? That's something really important to understand. So don't grant them a listening session or a town hall, don't push for that. It's just a way for them to show that they care, and it reinforces this idea that the police are not doing violence, but can therefore be held accountable for the things that have happened by mistake, etc. Push back when you're being told that the police must be at an event. Okay, we've experienced this with CHASM. Many people on this call have experienced this. The idea that a big event must have APD or UTPD involved is very much ingrained within the university structure, and these are things that I'm suggesting to student government, to Senate, to all these people who are in these meetings. I'm not in these meetings, right? like these are things that I'm saying are like an abolitionist framework to kind of thinking through what you can do. Refuse to sit on working groups and oversight committees until demands are listened to. Okay, oversight committees are not going to work with the police because, as we've proven, the police do not need oversight. They need to be shrunk and then abolished, right? They don't need oversight because they need to be gone, okay? So, and I know that's really hard to understand because oversight is something that is like a moralistic call, like we need to have oversight over this institution or like this thing that's happening. And I know that's a really hard one for a lot of folks to understand, but there is precedence for that. And it's one of these things that does not destabilize the idea of police being necessary. So again, use the chart, think things through. These are all ways that the UTPD entrenches themselves in the conversations about the police, right? So these are just the suggestions I have. This is not a complete list. I think that these are meetings that need to be had and brainstorming and organizing sessions that need to be had, but these are just the things off the top of my head that moving forward with these demands need to have. And there needs to be a consensus on this, right? There needs to be a call to say, like, you're not going to serve on this because I'm not going to serve on this. And it needs to be like a united, united effort. And again, I'm acknowledging that this is going to be difficult, especially for folks who are in a position where they are being held to be in these meetings and to serve on these panels and to call for these listening sessions, all those kinds of things. It's not that it's not difficult, it's that ingesting the framework demands that we think through why we're doing those things and why we're being called to do them. Sorry, did someone want to add something?
I was going to also say specifically on the various committees and meetings that are happening with UTPD right now. I guess this is kind of a call out in terms of what SG is doing. We need to be very serious about our advocacy for / with Black students because when you all go into those meetings, you don't need to back down. You know, you need to stick to those demands because unfortunately, the university is going to use anything it can to not only divide us and create more confusion between all of the students, but also to kind of compromise on what the demands are. And so the intensity that we're seeing on social, well, I don't know if it'd be intense, but for some of you, the intensity that we're seeing on social media and this commitment to Black lives and working hard to create this better future, that same intensity present when you are doing the work in whatever avenue that is. So yes, we have multiple members of the administration who are Black, and this is probably a conversation I can have in more detail later, probably with more Black individuals. But a lot of them have some of the same harmful project some of the same harmful thinking onto the student body in terms of the institution and policing. And still, you have to be committed to pushing back against that. There is a way in which you can do so where you don't continue to perpetuate anti-Blackness, but you have to make sure that you are sticking to these demands and you are recognizing that you sticking to these demands are not only for Black students, but for those Black administrators who are actively also experiencing violence because of the police. So yeah, when you continue to move forward with the action, now that we have the demands, I really like that for the athletes who put together their statement, that they also had corresponding strategies for how they're going to stand by those demands, right? And so I think what we're lacking right now, what we need to discuss further is our strategies for how we're going to stick with those demands. And Sarah gives us a lot of options for how we're going to do that, but collectively as a student body, we have to do something to get them to recognize that we are the ones that have the ability and the capacity to make these decisions, and either they get with it or they get got. And if they get got, then that just means that they get got. So yeah.
That was amazing. Perfect. Thank you, Jord. Okay, so the other thing that I'm going to say is Miriam Kaba and Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore talk about how, we mentioned this before, Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about how abolition is a presence, okay? We also talked about how abolition is not just closing the prisons and ending policing, it's building something else. So in the case of UT, we need to think about that as well. And I think this answers I kind of answered it with things that we should be thinking about, but we need to be imaginative about the positive as well. So it's not just a negative, and I don't mean negative and positive as good and bad. I mean like a literal action. So not just tearing down things, but then building them as a positive, a positive momentum. So UT is an incredible research hub. We're told this over and over and over again. I forget what we're told. It's the #1 research something in the world, or I don't know. So people have told me that the research is really great, that there's so much great scholarship and all those kinds of things. There, as I've said before, there are people at this university working on restorative justice who can think bigger than this administration, public health people who can think through what a non-carceral, non-police response is to a mental health situation. We need to start the building aspect of it too, right? We need to make the response as well as we're tearing these things down. Because when you actually build the alternative, I hate the word alternative, but if you build the response that actually gets at the root of it, it proves that the police are unnecessary. right? Like, how powerful would it be if students are taking care of each other and we're like not calling the police for every single fucking thing that happens, right? You're actively proving that we don't need it because we're building something else. And I know that's a lot of labor, but if anything, the last 4 years at UT has taught me that students often create things for themselves before the administration even knows it's a problem, right? I mean, I'm out of the Multicultural Engagement Center, right? We were having conversations at the like 10 years ago that the university is just now getting into, right? So we need to create these things for ourselves because the administration is not going to do it for us, right? It's a lot of labor. Maybe the institution should be doing it, but it's not. So, you know, thinking through, I've thought about, you know, what if we had a transformative justice collective at UT, right? It's going to take a lot. Like, that is like hard. Like, it's hard to think about. It's like hard and it's messy and it's going to take a lot of work. But what if we could pay people to be, you know, to help with these community accountability projects? Like, I mean, the things are endless, right? We do not know what this looks like because we've never experienced it. But we need to think big about the alternative building, the new world we want, right? And it also will actively eat at this, you know, group of people on campus who are like pro-police, who are police preservationists, right? If we give them an alternative option, they could, you know, imagine that future, and we need to be actively building that. Let's see, what is next? Something else I wanted to point out, because we're talking about the whole demands, is my friend Fern pointed this out to me, and I think it's a very great point, is what one of our demands is to rename the racist buildings. But what are we renaming them, right? Like, we need to think through this as well. And one of the things that was pointed out to me is that often when buildings in the streets that are renamed from something racist or call back to something racist or whatever it may be, they're often switched to something like colorblind. An example being that Creekside Dormitory was already renamed from like a racist person whose name I'm not going to mention and or remember, but it was just renamed to Creekside, which is, I think we can all believe, is just like a bland ass, like, here is next to a creek, right? So Dr. Derek Alderman speaks about this, and I'm going to read a quote from his work because it really illuminated a lot of things for me. Even when school officials decommemorate the names of Confederate generals, slave owners, Ku Klux Klan leaders, or segregationists, they often leave unfinished the memory work of transforming these racialized places into sites of anti-racism. I argue that replacements for the embattled names have tended to be generic, sanitized, and colorblind place monikers seemingly more concerned with avoiding further controversy than recovering and doing justice to a Black sense of place. Less common is to find university buildings and places renamed for African Americans, which represent a denied opportunity for creating a reparative, regenerative, and responsible geography of memory. Finally, I encourage universities to document the historical political origins and social emotional impacts of named buildings and other spaces, to develop policies that incorporate social justice and inclusive participation into campus landscape decisions, and to combine place rename change with educational programming, digital augmented reality, and the design of contextual signage. Okay, that's a lot, but it is one of those ways to think through, what are we building, right? It's not that we're creating like a flat negative, like a flat, we're turning this place to a no racism zone, right? It's that we have to like actively build something else, and abolition calls us to do that in our memory work and in anti-carceral thinking, like all these kinds of things. And I think that's a great example of how every demand has to have the other side of it, right? Like, what are we doing to replace, to repair, to think through, and also be ahead of administration when they say, let's rename Littlefield Hall to, I don't know, like orange and white. I don't know what they would rename it, but it would be something not like anti-racist, right? We have to be ahead of them, is my point about the organizing framework. Go ahead.
The renaming situation, not only do we need to avoid renaming buildings and infrastructure in a way that would erase color or erase the experiences of Black folks, but not to knock on or to push against MLK as a figure who has really contributed to our freedom. But we don't need multiple MLK boulevards and buildings and that is pandering to a source of respectability that re-entrenches us in this normalcy and being able to determine who is worthy, who deserves to be punished and who doesn't. When we think about renaming these buildings and pieces of campus, we need to think about, people outside of what is considered the norm, or who are not as close in proximity to whiteness, and how we can honor them, uplift them, and encourage others to do the same.
Thanks for that, Jordan. Okay, so the kind of thing that I'll leave you with is, and we can, we're going to continue to answer questions and, any comments that anyone else has, of course. But the things that I was kind of wanting to close with was, for this portion, is think about ways that you in your current position and your current place and role on this campus can support the demands and organize the people around you. Okay, these are ambitious demands, and they're going to require people who normally aren't at the table for this kind of discussion, right? It's going to take them more than the usual organizers and ethnic studies majors. We get shit done, but we need a huge shift in the thinking of this university, right? We need people in engineering to think through the ways that engineering has harmed people and reinforces policing. We need people in the medical school to think through how medicine has policing ingrained in it and is racist and so many other things, right? We need people to think through how policing and imprisonment and carceral punishment is ingrained in all these things that, that we engage with in the roles that we have at our university. I think through at my job, right? Have we had the conversation about what happens when police are called to a DDCE event? We're talking about marginalized students, right? Like, these are the things that we need to be talking about, how to actively work against them. Have you had conversations with people in your orgs about why they shouldn't call the police on houseless people who are just walking down the street or sitting on the sidewalk, right? You need to host a session in your org to talk about why you shouldn't call the cops. You need to talk about how cops escalate situations and endanger people. Career fairs. Are the FBI, the CIA, and the local police department at the career fairs? Yes. Right? Is ICE at the career fairs? Yes. Right? Like, these are the things that we need to be talking about and actively pushing back against. And I know people are listening right now that organize these events, right? And we all need to take responsibility of the ways that we're complicit in the PIC if we're going to ever have the opportunity to really shrink its influence and its size, both at the university but also in society and the country in general. So that's kind of what I want you to leave you with. Think about the ways that you personally, your org, your role, your job interact with policing in prisons, and think through, using this framework that we've offered, the graphic that is immensely helpful, to think through how you can then change things and push back against these things in your life. George, you got anything else? Brett? Now we're gonna do a Q&A afterwards, but I just wanna.
I don't think I have anything else. Sarah, you're just so wonderful. You're just such a wonderful person. And I think I speak for everyone when we say that you are contributing so much to a lot right now. So I just, wow.
Same to you. We literally I feel like there's magical presence in the air every time you talk and offer your wonderful words. Okay, so I think we can move on to Q&A. I know we've got questions beyond the ones that I've been answering as we go on. Suzette, let me know how you want to do this.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, there's a Google form for anonymous questions, and there was actually 50 questions that were submitted. We tried to integrate some of them, but obviously we did want Sarah and George to get through their outline, because I thought their outline was so good, and I just wanted everybody to get the chance to do those. So my first question is going to be, oh my gosh, I just lost.
How many questions are we going to do?
Oh yeah, how many are y'all comfortable with? We can finish this at 7, so about 5 or.
I think that's reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just get at the ones that you feel like we haven't touched on, if that makes sense. And then any other ones afterwards, when we're doing the resource doc, if there's any like questions I feel like we just need to write out the answers to, I can do that as well.
Yeah, also a clarifying thing, if you want these, I know Sarah said that she's going to send a information doc with like a bunch of resources. If you want to fill that Google form out and like put your email and like we can actually email it to you, that'd be awesome. We're going to post it on the Senate page and like on this event page as well. But if you want like a direct source to that, just make sure to fill that Google form out and like your email, if you're comfortable with that. So
also one more thing, sorry. Based on what we still have left, we're probably not gonna end at 7. I'm sorry to say. I know this has been long, but I just want to put that out there. I'm sorry. Just wanted to say.
We could probably just like aim to wrap up around 7, and then do a lot of like the follow-up steps / send like a PDF with all the answered questions to all 50 whatever, just to like respect y'all's time, because I know it's already been like a long time. So
yeah, I think this one's a UT specific one, and so trigger warning, UT stabbing. One thing I've had trouble responding to when discussing UTPD abolition within my communities is something along the lines of UTPD responded to the jester stabber within 2 minutes of being called, which saved lives. I answer, responding to something like that is the exception rather than the rule for the day-to-day responsibilities of UTPD. The vast majority of their work is far more mundane responsibilities and definitely doesn't require them to be carrying lethal firepower. More often than not, police officers today are just social workers with less social work training and more weapons. Is there anything else you guys could add / critique to make the counter argument stronger?
One, I think that's a great counter argument. I mean, I think you're getting at the root of this kind of like connection between social work and policing, and then also you're totally right, it's the exception rather than the rule. And I know that's I was there at the stabbing. It was one of the scariest days of my entire life. I was like, I don't know, maybe 100 feet away when it happened, and I'm not saying that makes me like it's like adjacent to what happened or anything like that, but I'm saying is I want to speak to the fact that was a very scary day. And I understand why that is a question that is constantly put to us. And I think, again, it's the exception rather than the rule. And also, I think it's been very clear in the years after that was very much rooted in a mental health crisis, right? And I know we don't want to speak to that sometimes, especially when we're talking about the person who does the harm, but we have to have really messy conversations in order to achieve what we're talking about. Right. And I think I think it's been very clear since then that was a mental health crisis that, was created from a lot of harm and a lot of, and that ended in a horrific ending. But I think that the police responded in 2 minutes, but I also think if we imagine something different, like a mental health response team or something that didn't have weapons or didn't criminalize, I think that we have to be really imaginative about why that one situation doesn't necessitate all of the other harassment and violence that UTPD has perpetuated on the community. And I think we've outlined the history there. And it's not, and the presence of the police is not justified by that situation. That's what abolition has taught me about those exceptions to the rules and protection and safety and all those kinds of things. Jordan, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but that's kind of how I think about it.
I completely agree. I think that the response is spot on, and then everything, of course, what you said, that being a mental health crisis, and that it just goes to show again that there are other places that we should be investing
in. Yeah, thank you for that answer. And I will say that there's a lot of people that have not encountered any situation with UTPD, just like them saying hi to you. But as an RA, like Sarah mentioned previously, like we're trained to respond to any situation with UTPD rather than like, deal with the problem. Like, for example, that exact thing where there was a trespasser in our residence hall, and like I didn't call the police because I obviously like I just did it because that's not how my brain works. And then I went to my supervisor and she said that I was wrong for that. And that was like something to, I don't know, for a minute I was like, was I really wrong for not calling a police for a trespasser? And that's like this type of conversations that you need to have. So thank you, Sarah, for saying that. The next question that is, with an abolitionist framework, what would be the perspective on going to law school for civil rights law / criminal defense law? Do those professions continue to entrench racism / inequality by participating in the system?
Yes. I think on an individual level, again, you have individuals who are going to law school who are getting this degree and continuing to perpetuate racism in the work that they do. And there are a lot of different examples of that. An example that I think more people are, well, I'm not exactly sure if she was a lawyer, but we'll just say she basically an op. But when people use, racism informs their actions. And so I'll move on because I'm about to hurt someone's feelings. Anyway, so yes, they go on to, racism on an individual level will inform the decisions and the actions that they take. But also these systems that we are working within, a lot of times are already built off of the oppression and the exploitation of Black people and other marginalized communities. So there's only so much you can do within a system to try and make an experience or improve the lives of the people that you are motivated to serve. I think that I'm not sure if that should necessarily deter someone from going to law school because they're interested in making sure that people are accounted for and that quote unquote justice is served. But I think that there needs to be that dual acknowledgement that long term, we shouldn't even have to be dealing with the prison industrial complex in general. So I guess that's where I'm coming from.
And I think something I'll add to that is, and why I offer what the question of what you should be doing is thinking, one, adjusting the framework and understanding what abolition is. And if you're going to get a law degree, use that degree to try to shrink the PIC and lessen the number of people who are actually going into prisons, right? Like I that's what I would offer, right? I will say this is kind of, like not abolition advanced, but like something that you have to think about is a lot of the times these systems also separate like the innocent versus the guilty, if that makes sense. So thinking through the responsibility of what lawyers do in terms of, only focusing on the nonviolent, innocent children, women, etc. Not that you shouldn't be, focusing on marginalized populations, but sometimes these actions also re-entrench the idea that there is guilty, violent people that should be in prison, which is not what we're going for. So that's something to think about. And an example that I'll bring up is that there's a lot of campaigns for the innocent, and which should be happening because it's people getting out of prison, right, or like not being killed by the state, etc. But an example that I'll bring up is Survived and Punished, which is a network of all of these campaigns that were actually not talking about whether or not this person was innocent, but getting this person out of prison. All these campaigns of women who killed or harmed the person that was abusing them because they called the police, or they didn't call the police, or they tried to report or abuse, but nothing was working, and they were being threatened, and they were then criminalized for harming and or in some cases murdering the person who was abusing them. Again, a messy, difficult conversation, but Survived and Punished was built on that fact that these people were not necessarily innocent of what happened, right? But the justice system, the punishment system, punished them for protecting themselves when the system failed them. So again, this is a messy conversation, but that needs lawyers, right? So that's something to think about, I guess. Think about where you're using your talents and your degrees and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. This will be our last question, and it ties into kind of what you were already talking about in terms of people finding their place in this movement. But what are the ways generally in which you practice abolition in your everyday lives? And also, I think extending that, what would you recommend others that are watching to engage with as well?
So there's this book called The Revolution Starts at Home. It's an abolitionist framework. And I like that phrase a lot, the revolution starts at home, because I think having this conversation like with the people who are closest to you is really hard sometimes, especially if these people have been either harmed and by other people and or the punishment system themselves. But I think one thing that I could offer to people is like, you should talk to your roommates about why you as a household wouldn't call the police for something. Like these kinds of things. And I think also in my everyday life, once you like kind of learn abolition as a framework, it's so much easier to suss out the ways that like our language and the words we use for people create these binaries of good and bad, of people who should be in cages, who should not be in cages. Like abolition gives you also so much framework for other, things that seemingly aren't connected to policing in prisons. Like I also do some reproductive justice organizing, and I view abolition as reproductive justice, right? Because policing in prisons interferes in people's abilities to create and raise families, which is, what reproductive justice is about. So, I mean, that's kind of like a roundabout answer, but like there are ways to implement it into everyday lives. I also, you need to be engaging with the literature. I think that's hard for people to hear. Sometimes I feel like I'm like a broken record just telling people to read. And I know it's difficult, and there's different ways of doing it. Like you can listen to podcasts, you can listen to audiobooks, you can look at the graphics that are like amazing graphic designers are like putting together. Artists talk about abolition, right? And you also need to start to think of policing in prisons as something that's encroaching upon your life, whether or not you realize it or not, right? And I think that's an important step because it radicalizes you around this notion that like abolition is a framework and that it's a framework and it's a way of life and it's a theory of change. So I think also dissolving what aspects of like police propaganda or prisons propaganda that you like are ingesting is important too, or at least dealing with it, like at least like calling it to attention and talking about it. I think is really important. Sorry, that was kind of a roundabout answer, but that's what I'm thinking about.
I entirely agree. I think, again, having those conversations, like Sarah said, is so important and crucial. The education is a part of organizing. It's a part of any movement. And we all have much more and farther to go, and we always will. Wherever you are, this is your opportunity. This is your time to really hop on and start engaging with the people who have been doing the work and learn, because it can't fall on a small number of people. This is collective work. This is collective imagination. So we need you. You are essential to the work that we are doing. So that means that you have to start reading. That means you have to start asking questions, start inquiring within, and questioning everything that you know, literally. And including the histories that we've come to understand as what they are. I also think that, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about this, is that these individuals who we think are so far away from us. So we're thinking about political prisoners and people who are being held in ICE detention centers. We need to recognize that they're very close to us. They are very intimately connected to our livelihoods and our experiences. And once you recognize that, you need to, something that I'm trying to do is recognize that every decision that I make affects them. And that the work that I do, the things that I'm interested in, what actions I take, has to consider or push for them to come even closer to my own humanity. Yeah, if that makes sense. I don't know, that was kind of all over the place. But yeah, then just a baseline level, just don't fucking call the police. Like, don't call the police. I'm sorry if there are people on this live watching that are opposed to cursing.
So that was the last question. I just have like a couple like just follow-up statements to close us off. As Jordan is describing, there is nothing wrong with not knowing something, but now is the time to make the decision that you want to learn. Let the moment radicalize you. Let what's going on right now call you to action about what you need to be doing, about what reading you need to do, about what education you need to do, and then use that in your work, whatever your work looks like. We must all do the work together to achieve this end goal. And I'm a facilitator. We always do a closing question. I can't ask you guys this question because of Zoom, but one of the best exercises that I've ever done, these two questions I thought of that I think are very important is, I love the exercise of one, closing your eyes and thinking of what the world looks like without prison. Like, what does that look like to you? My answer has always been like endless green. Like that is what I imagine, right? But I think that image changes over time as you realize how big abolition is and like what possibilities it has. And the other question I urge you to answer and think about, like write it down, journal about it, whatever. What is something that is happening at UT or did happen at UT that you thought would never happen, right? That you were told over and over again that wouldn't happen. I have been here forever. I've not been here forever. I've been here for almost four full years. But I know a lot of you got here after this happened, but we were told over and over and over again that CMHC would never give free sessions. That is a very specific answer that I often talk about because people who are younger than me are like, what? Like, that is unbelievable because now you can get free sessions at CMHC, but I remember a time when we were told over and over and over again, CMHC will never give you free sessions. The salaries of our counselors come directly out of the fees from CMHC free sessions. And then because of organizing, because of constant advocacy, constant pressure, constantly holding the institution accountable, or literally organizing and educating and talking to the counselors at CMHC who were doing the work, who wanted this to happen, that happened, right? And those sessions have done something, have given people access to mental health resources, and that's been a tangible change. So I offer that because while it may seem impossible, we are working towards a goal. And if we are all united towards that goal, we can have wins along the way. And Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about how she's not going to see the abolition of prisons, right? She's not going to see the abolition of policing. I may not see the divestment at UT, right? But it doesn't mean that you can't work towards it. You can't add to the conversation, that you can't do these kinds of things that we're doing now so that people in 4 years can like watch this and be like, this is what they were talking about. This is the framework and this is the strategies we used, right? It's really important. So yeah, that was what I got. I'm sorry this was so long, but this is such a big topic that we haven't talked about enough. And I will be sending out all the resources that I got to y'all. So.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for those concluding statements. And I definitely urge everyone who's listening or watching the recording to really think about what that means for you specifically, because I think that helps so much in terms of imagination and just like mobilizing yourself as a whole. And yeah, I think I don't have any other like concluding statement to add. Sarah, just.
I will add.
Yeah, go ahead.
I know we're really pushing it. Nothing, not a lot, just I know that, well, first off, Black Lives Matter is not a week, and it's not a month. It is lifelong, it is eternal, it is forever. And I know that some people are kind of getting burnt out. Some people are overwhelmed, they're stressed. Take the time you need to relax, rest, and restore yourselves, because we have to move forward with more intensity. And whatever you're doing, continue doing it and do more.
Thank you so much for that, Jordan. Absolutely agree. Some more logistical things in addition to what Sarah is sending. The recording of this will also be posted to the event page as well as on Senate's Facebook page too. And all of the unanswered questions, we'll also put those out with answers eventually on those pages as well. Suzette, is there anything I'm missing specifically?
No, that was it. Thank you all for sticking around. 46 people are still watching. It was 2 hours, a whole ass movie. But thank you all for speaking at this. It's so important, and like, yeah, thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
Thank you all for having us. I cannot believe we did this. Like, It's like a dream come true. So thanks, y'all.
Yeah. You all have a great night. Thanks to everyone watching. And yeah, bye, y'all.